The desert stretched endlessly beneath a sun that seemed too harsh to be real. Dust swirled across the cracked earth, bending in waves like heat rising from the scorched ground. The wind carried the faint, acrid smell of charred wood and the whisper of distant danger. Out here, life was a cruel teacher, and only the cunning, or the desperate, managed to survive. Rafe Calder rode alone, his horse's hooves kicking up tiny storms of sand with every step. The outlaw's eyes, sharp and cautious, scanned the horizon. His dark coat flapped in the wind, and the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat stretched long across the desert floor. He had learned long ago that trust was a luxury the West could not afford, and kindness was a weapon that often cut the bearer first. Rafe's world was simple: steal, hide, and ride. Every man he had ever known had either betrayed him or ended up 6 feet under. Life, in all its harshness, had taught him one truth: survival mattered above all else. Justice, loyalty, even love, they were stories for children and fools. He had no place for them. But that day, the desert whispered something different. Smoke curled in the distance, thin and black against the pale sky. Rafe narrowed his eyes, gripping the reins tighter. Burned wagons were not uncommon in these parts, a consequence of lawless roads and desperate men. Loot and death usually went hand in hand. Most travelers who ventured too far into the wilderness ended up as nothing more than ash scattered by the wind. Rafe slowed his horse, his instincts alert. There was a strange rhythm to the smoke, uneven, almost deliberate. He had seen enough death to know that danger often wore a familiar shape, but sometimes, it came dressed in something completely unexpected. As he drew closer, the outline of a wagon emerged through the haze. The wood was blackened, the wheels charred beyond repair. The remnants of its cargo were scattered, unrecognizable, beneath the unforgiving sun. A sense of dread prickled Rafe's spine. He had anticipated corpses, perhaps a wounded traveler, or even nothing but the cruel echoes of fire. Instead, he saw movement. A figure crouched beneath the wreckage, shivering despite the heat. At first, she looked fragile, almost a mirage against the ruin of the wagon. But even from a distance, Rafe noticed the fire in her eyes, sharp, determined, alive. Her hair was matted with dust, and her hands clutched something close to her chest, something blackened and crumbling. Charred letters, he realized, once belonging to someone else, now reduced to ashes and memory. Rafe slid from his saddle slowly, keeping his hands visible, though he doubted it would make much difference. "Well now," he murmured, a skeptical grin tugging at his lips. "What do we have here?" The woman looked up, fear etched into her features, but not desperation alone. There was defiance there, too, a boldness that seemed far too dangerous for someone so clearly at the mercy of fate. "You have to take me to the sheriff," she said, voice trembling, yet steady. "But first, you must promise me something." Rafe raised an eyebrow, the grin widening just slightly. "And what could that be, little lady?" Her gaze met his, unflinching. "I need you to help me bury my husband's killer, and make sure no one else suffers like I did." For a moment, the wind itself seemed to pause. Rafe's heart, long accustomed to the rhythm of self-preservation, skipped a beat he didn't expect. Justice? Revenge? These were not his concerns. He had spent his life avoiding the law, evading bounty hunters, and leaving towns behind with no more than a smirk and a memory of his shadow. Yet, something about her plea struck a chord he hadn't realized was there. The fire in her eyes, the weight of her words, the silent promise of danger, it all pulled at him, a challenge no outlaw could ignore. Rafe studied her for a long moment, calculating the risk. Helping her could mean trouble, maybe even death. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt curiosity prick at him. And curiosity, as he knew too well, often led a man into places he never planned to go. The desert wind shifted. Somewhere far away, a vulture wheeled lazily overhead, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Rafe Calder made his choice. He would listen. He would follow. And, somehow, the lawless desert had just become a little more dangerous, and a little more alive, than he had ever known. Rafe stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly on the grip of his revolver, the other holding his horse steady. The woman's words hung in the dry air like smoke, strange and impossible, yet heavy with meaning. He had ridden across countless deserts, crossed paths with men who killed without hesitation, and faced dangers that would have left most dead before sunrise. But this was different. Maribel Kane, her name as fragile and precise as her voice, emerged fully from the wreckage. She brushed dust from her skirt and clutched the charred letters to her chest like a talisman. Her eyes, wide and unyielding, never left him. "I can't do it myself," she whispered. "I need someone, strong enough, to see justice done." Rafe tilted his head, studying her. Justice? In his experience, that word was meaningless in the West. Law was bought, stolen, or ignored entirely. But there was a fire in her gaze that challenged him, daring him to defy the natural order he had learned to accept, survive, and let the rest fall where it may. "You're talking about a man who's already done enough harm," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "A man who deserves more than a whisper of justice. He took my husband from me. He left nothing but ashes and lies behind. I can't. I won't let anyone else pay the same price." Rafe's grin was faint, skeptical. "And you want me to do what exactly? Dig a grave, light a candle, and pray he rots in peace?" His tone carried more mockery than malice, yet the shadow of curiosity was growing. Maribel's lips pressed into a thin line. "No. I want him gone. Completely. And I want anyone else who follows in his path to stop. I can't fight him alone. I've seen what he's capable of." For a long moment, Rafe said nothing. His mind raced, weighing danger against reward. Helping her could bring the law down on him, attract every bounty hunter in the territory, or worse, draw vengeance from men who didn't forgive. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt a pull stronger than fear. Something about her unwavering courage, about the raw honesty in her plea, made his usual cynicism feel hollow. "Why me?" he asked finally, his voice low and guarded. "Why not find the sheriff yourself?" Maribel's eyes flicked to the horizon, where the heat shimmered off the sand in waves. "The sheriff isn't fast enough. He isn't brave enough. You've seen the world for what it is. You survive where others fail. I don't trust anyone else to do what needs to be done." Rafe felt the weight of her words settle over him like the desert heat. The thought of helping her went against everything he had built his life on. His freedom, his solitude, his outlaw code, they all demanded he turn away, ride on, and leave her to the harshness of the world. Yet something inside him, a long-buried spark of conscience, or perhaps curiosity, whispered that this path could be different. He glanced at the burned wagon one last time, at the ruin and ashes that marked the beginning of this strange tale. And then he looked at Maribel, her hand gripping the charred letters, her gaze unwavering despite her trembling body. She was fragile, yes, but there was steel beneath the surface. Strength hidden by circumstance, waiting to be tested. Rafe exhaled, the desert wind carrying his decision across the dunes. "All right, little lady," he said, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "I'll help you. But understand this. I'm no saint. And I don't play by anyone's rules." Maribel nodded, relief flashing across her features, quickly replaced by determination. "I don't ask for saints," she said quietly. "I ask for someone willing to stand with me." For a moment, the desert seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the beginning of their uneasy alliance. The wind stirred the ash around the wagon, and somewhere distant, a vulture wheeled overhead, circling lazily. Danger would follow them, it always did, but for now, there was movement, purpose, and a fragile thread of trust binding the outlaw and the deserted bride together. And so, Rafe Calder led his horse down the scorched trail, with Maribel Kane following, clutching her bundle of memories and grief. Across the endless desert, a new journey had begun, one of danger, moral choice, and the first whispers of something neither of them could have expected, redemption. The desert stretched before them like an endless sea of gold and dust. Rafe led his horse along the cracked trail, the rhythm of hooves striking the earth a steady reminder of the lawless world they now traversed together. Behind him, Maribel Kane followed, clutching her charred letters as though they contained not just memories, but the fragile blueprint of her life. Rafe's mind churned with unease. He had agreed to help her, but every step reminded him of the risks. Out here, miles from town and safety, one misstep could mean death. Yet the outlaw in him felt a flicker of something foreign, responsibility, maybe, or a curiosity he hadn't known in years. He had spent his life running from trouble, not chasing it. And now, he was chasing the very thing he had avoided, justice. "Are you always this reckless?" he asked, glancing back at her. His tone was more cautious than teasing. Danger had a way of sharpening words. Maribel shook her head, dust settling in her hair. "I didn't ask for reckless," she said. "I asked for someone willing. That's different." Rafe smirked, though the gesture was half-hearted. She was brave, that much was clear, but brave often led to folly. Out here, the desert had no patience for mistakes, and a foolish step could be final. They rode in silence for a time, the wind cutting across the dunes, carrying the scent of sun-baked earth and distant sagebrush. The silence was not awkward, it was necessary. Words could betray intentions, and Rafe knew that more than most. Still, as the hours passed, he couldn't ignore the small hints of her story. The letters she carried were charred, yes, but their significance lingered in the lines of her face, the set of her shoulders, the quiet tremor in her hands. "Tell me about him," Rafe said finally, nodding toward the letters. "Your husband." Maribel hesitated, glancing down at the bundle. He trusted the wrong people," she said quietly. "He believed in kindness in a world that didn't deserve it. And it cost him everything." Rafe's jaw tightened. He had met enough men who had been betrayed to understand the sting of misplaced trust. "And this man you want gone?" he asked. "He's the one responsible." She nodded. Her eyes, sharp with grief and determination, met his. "He killed my husband and left me nothing but ashes. I can't let him hurt anyone else. I won't." Rafe exhaled slowly, the wind scattering dust across the trail. Helping her was beginning to feel less like a favor and more like a choice with weight, one that could change the path of both their lives. He had promised to aid her, yes, but promises in the West were fragile things, often broken by circumstance or greed. As the sun climbed higher, their path became more treacherous. The desert was unforgiving, shifting sands, hidden gullies, and the relentless glare of sunlight that seemed determined to expose every weakness. Maribel struggled with her horse, her strength tested by the harsh conditions. Rafe noticed her grim determination, the way she refused to falter despite exhaustion. She was more resilient than she appeared, more than a bride in need of saving. By mid-afternoon, they found themselves at a small wash, a narrow ribbon of rocky soil that offered little shade. Rafe dismounted, stretching his legs while keeping an eye on the horizon. He had learned that danger often arrived when least expected, and that patience was as crucial as a well-aimed shot. Maribel sat quietly, brushing dust from her skirt. "I know you don't trust easily," she said, her voice low. "I don't either. But we can't do this alone." Rafe nodded, acknowledging the truth without speaking. Trust was a currency neither of them could afford freely, but necessity often forced its exchange. The hours passed with slow, deliberate steps, the desert testing them with every mile. Every gust of wind, every shadow, every distant echo of movement reminded Rafe that the West demanded vigilance. And yet, beneath the heat and danger, a fragile alliance began to take shape. Maribel's secrets, her grief, her determination, they were slowly weaving a connection between them, binding two strangers with the invisible threads of shared purpose. For Rafe, it was an unfamiliar feeling. Responsibility. Care. Perhaps even something resembling hope. And for Maribel, it was the first time in days that she felt the weight of the world lighten, if only slightly, in the presence of someone willing to stand with her. The desert stretched on, endless and unforgiving, but together they rode, two figures bound by circumstance, courage, and the beginning of trust. And as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in bruised golds and reds, both knew the journey ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The desert sun climbed relentlessly, turning the world into a shimmering haze of gold and heat. Each mile they traveled tested them, both physically and mentally. Sand clung to sweat-soaked skin, and every gust of wind seemed determined to strip away hope along with the topsoil. Rafe Calder rode ahead, ever watchful, his eyes scanning the horizon for trouble. He had faced men, beasts, and betrayal before, but the desert had a way of humbling even the cleverest outlaw. Maribel Kane followed, riding with a mix of determination and fatigue. Her hands blistered from gripping the reins, her throat dry from the heat, but she pressed on, clutching her charred letters as though they were a compass guiding her through the chaos. With every step, her resolve hardened. She had asked Rafe for help, and he had accepted, but the path they traveled was far from simple. "Rafe," she called after a stretch of silence, "how much farther do you think the sheriff is?" He didn't answer immediately, his mind calculating. Distance was one thing. Danger was another. And in the West, both were rarely measured in miles alone. "We don't know if we'll see a sheriff before the sun sets," he said finally, his voice calm, but edged with warning. "Out here, people who wander too far often disappear without a trace." Maribel swallowed hard but didn't waver. "Then we'll keep moving. We have to. There's no turning back now." As they pressed on, the tension between them became tangible. Rafe's outlaw instincts clashed with Maribel's moral mission at every turn. He saw threats in every shadow, every distant rise in the sand. Her focus, however, was on the justice she demanded. She spoke less of fear and more of responsibility, each word a reminder that the path they walked carried weight far beyond themselves. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of trouble appeared. A distant cloud of dust rose on the horizon, jagged and erratic, like a storm approaching. Rafe narrowed his eyes, recognition sharp. "Posse," he muttered under his breath, the single word heavy with danger. "We've got company." Maribel's hands tightened around her bundle of letters. "How many?" she asked, trying to measure the threat. "Enough to make this dangerous," Rafe said grimly. He scanned the horizon again, noting their approach. "They're tracking someone. Probably tracking you." The reality of the threat pressed down on them. Every decision now carried consequences heavier than the sun overhead. The desert, which had tested them with heat and fatigue, now became a stage for confrontation. Rafe's mind raced, considering ways to evade or outsmart the hunters. But Maribel's purpose remained unshaken, her moral mission unyielding. She would not let fear dictate her actions, even if it meant putting herself, and Rafe, at risk. "I need to tell you more," Maribel said quietly, the words almost lost in the wind. "About my husband, about the man who destroyed him. I can't keep it all inside anymore." Rafe's gaze softened slightly, his cynicism clashing with the unusual impulse to listen. "Go on," he said, his voice low. "But be quick. Danger doesn't wait for stories." Maribel glanced at him, the edges of exhaustion and grief softening into a glimmer of trust. "He betrayed my husband in ways I didn't even imagine. Business, friends, even the people closest to us. He left him vulnerable, and then he struck. He's clever, and cruel, and he won't stop until someone like me is gone." Rafe's jaw tightened. He understood betrayal, more than most. But her words ignited a rare emotion inside him, a mix of anger and protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else," he said, determination threading his tone. "And we'll do it on our terms." The sun began its slow descent, painting the desert in bruised oranges and purples. Ahead, the dust of the posse rose higher, closer now, a reminder that danger was no longer abstract. Each step forward was measured, every glance backward a warning. They were trapped in the desert's harsh embrace, tested not just by terrain, but by moral choices, by fear, and by the growing bond between them. Rafe realized that the outlaw code he had lived by, survive, hide, and run, might no longer be enough. With Maribel's mission pushing him towards something greater, he began to understand that the West had more than one way of testing a man. It could break him, yes, but it could also change him, if he was willing to take the risk. And as the shadows lengthened across the dunes, Rafe Calder and Maribel Kane pressed on, two figures bound by necessity, courage, and the unspoken understanding that their journey had only just begun, and the desert was far from done testing them. The desert had a way of hiding its dangers until it was too late. That afternoon, the distant dust on the horizon grew sharper, more deliberate. Rafe Calder's instincts flared like fire in his veins. He had seen this before, the sudden, purposeful motion of men closing in, a storm of boots and horses meant to corner, overwhelm, and destroy. Maribel, he warned, his voice low and urgent, we've got company. They're faster than we are if we don't move smart. Maribel's eyes widened, but she did not falter. She had been bracing herself for this moment, carrying the weight of fear and determination in equal measure. Who are they? She asked, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. Posse, Rafe said grimly. Bounty hunters. Or men seeking revenge. Either way, they won't hesitate. He scanned the horizon, calculating escape routes, places to hide, and options for confrontation. We need to act. Now. The outlaw and the bride moved quickly, weaving through jagged washes and sparse brush, every step measured, every glance backward a reminder of the hunters gaining ground. Maribel's heart raced, but she kept pace, her determination driving her forward. This was no longer just about justice, it was about survival, and every choice mattered. As they rounded a narrow canyon, a sudden volley of shots rang out. Rafe ducked instinctively, pulling Maribel behind a rock. The bullets kicked up sand and gravel, reminding them both that the desert was not forgiving. The posse had found them, and the reality of their situation hit hard. Escape was possible, but only with precision and courage. Rafe's mind raced. He had spent his life avoiding responsibility, hiding from danger, and running from trouble. And yet, here he was, standing between Maribel and the threat that pursued her. Helping her could cost his freedom, or his life, but the thought of letting her face this alone was impossible. Stay low, he instructed, his tone carrying authority. I'll draw them away if I have to. Maribel's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was unspoken understanding. She was more than a fragile bride, more than a grieving widow. She was brave, resourceful, and willing to face danger head-on. I trust you, she said softly, a statement heavier than any promise. The posse moved closer, their shouts and the clatter of hooves echoing through the canyon. Rafe's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He made a decision, they would not run blindly. He led Maribel through a series of narrow, winding paths only someone familiar with the desert could navigate, using the terrain to their advantage. The hunters pursued, but the canyon twisted and turned, slowing them and giving the pair precious seconds to gain distance. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the sand, and the two began to understand something profound. They were no longer simply outlaw and bride, they were partners in survival. Trust, once an abstract notion, had become their lifeline. Rafe's cynicism, carefully honed over years of self-preservation, began to crack, revealing glimpses of a man capable of loyalty, courage, and perhaps even redemption. By nightfall, they reached a small mesa, overlooking the desert below. The posse had not followed them this far. For the first time since the journey began, Rafe allowed himself a breath, watching Maribel as she clutched the charred letters. Her resilience had carried them through danger, her courage guiding his choices. You did well, he said quietly, almost to himself. Better than I thought. Maribel looked at him, a faint smile breaking through exhaustion and fear. We did it together, she corrected gently. Rafe nodded, understanding the truth in her words. In a world where survival was often the only law, where men like him lived in shadows and ran from consequence, he had found something unexpected: purpose. And with it came a dangerous, thrilling realization. Perhaps helping Maribel was not just about vengeance or justice. Perhaps it was about something more, a chance to be more than the outlaw he had always been. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the twilight sky, vast and unforgiving. Yet for the first time in years, Rafe Calder felt something he had long buried: hope. And as he and Maribel prepared to rest for the night, both knew the journey ahead would demand everything they had, and reveal the true measure of courage, trust, and redemption. Night fell over the desert like a velvet curtain, and the stars shone with a cold, indifferent light. The wind had dropped, leaving the world still, save for the soft whinny of Rafe's horse and the gentle rustle of Maribel adjusting the charred letters at her side. For a brief moment, the desert felt almost peaceful, but both of them knew better. Danger never rested. Rafe crouched by the fire he had built, scanning the horizon with careful, experienced eyes. The posse was still out there, and sooner or later, they would follow. "Sleep lightly," he murmured, more to himself than to Maribel. "We're not safe yet." Maribel watched him, exhaustion etched in her features, but there was a fire that refused to dim. "I don't need protection," she said softly. "I can handle myself." Rafe chuckled, a low, rough sound that didn't quite reach amusement. "I don't doubt it," he said. "But out here, it's not enough to be able. You have to be smart too." The next morning brought no relief. The sun rose like a furnace over the sand, relentless and unforgiving. Every mile they traveled seemed longer, the heat pressing down on them, testing endurance and willpower. Maribel's determination never wavered. She rode with purpose, her gaze sharp, her every motion deliberate. The desert, harsh and unyielding, became a crucible for both of them. At midday, they encountered a narrow canyon, a natural choke point where ambushes could be deadly. Rafe's eyes swept the rocks and shadows. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice tight. "This is where it gets dangerous." Maribel's grip on the reins tightened, but she did not hesitate. She had learned, in the short time since the wagon, that courage was more than bravery, it was endurance, and the willingness to face what others fled. "I'm ready," she said, and Rafe believed her. The canyon tested them immediately. Loose stones shifted beneath their horses' hooves, forcing careful, measured steps. Every sound echoed, and Rafe's instincts screamed for caution. But as they moved through the narrow path, he noticed something remarkable: Maribel was not faltering. She navigated the difficult terrain with surprising skill, her focus absolute. She was no longer just a bride in need of protection. She was an ally, a partner, capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with him. By afternoon, the heat and the chase began to weigh on them both. Rafe found himself questioning the life he had led for so long, the outlaw code that demanded survival above all else. Here, with Maribel at his side, he was facing a different kind of choice. Could he risk everything, not just for her mission, but for something greater? A man like him was meant to run, to hide, to abandon responsibility. Yet each step forward, each shared glance and unspoken understanding, chipped away at the walls he had built. "I need to know," Rafe said, his tone more serious than usual, "why you're willing to risk so much. Why does this fight matter so much to you?" Maribel looked at him, her face streaked with sweat and dust, but her eyes unwavering. "Because justice isn't about fear," she said quietly. "It's about standing up for those who can't. If I fail, someone else will pay the price. And I won't let that happen. Not again." Rafe nodded slowly, absorbing her words. The moral weight of her mission began to pull at him, mingling with his growing respect, and something deeper, something he had not felt in years: care. Helping her was no longer just a favor. It had become a test of character, of courage, of his ability to rise above the outlaw he had always been. The desert offered no mercy, no comfort. It challenged their bodies, their minds, and their resolve. But as the day waned and the shadows grew long, Rafe began to see a glimmer of possibility. Perhaps, in helping Maribel, he could do more than survive. Perhaps he could become the man he never thought he could be, someone capable of courage, of loyalty, and, in small moments, of hope. And as they rode on, the wind stirring the sand at their feet, both understood that the trials ahead would test them further, demanding every ounce of strength, trust, and determination they possessed. The desert grew colder as night fell, the sun dipping below the horizon and leaving behind a sky smeared with bruised purples and fading golds. Shadows stretched long and strange across the sand, transforming familiar dunes into looming threats. Rafe Calder rode with taut muscles, his senses sharpened to every sound, the crunch of rocks, the whisper of wind, even the faint, distant clatter of hooves. Danger was near. He could feel it pressing on them like the desert itself had turned against them. Maribel Kane rode beside him, her hand gripping the reins with a determination that belied her exhaustion. The day's relentless journey had tested her courage, her resolve, and her body, but she pressed on, eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow, for signs of pursuit. She knew they were being hunted, that the posse was relentless and clever. And yet, she refused to yield. There. Rafe muttered, pointing toward a distant rise. Dust swirled around a cluster of horsemen, moving fast, gaining on them. The posse had found their trail, and there was no room for hesitation. Maribel's stomach tightened. "Can we outrun them?" she asked, voice steady but edged with fear. Rafe shook his head. "Not forever," he said grimly. "They'll catch us if we don't force them into a mistake. And we need to be ready for that moment." The canyon walls narrowed, offering little room to maneuver. Rafe guided Maribel through twisting paths, forcing their pursuers into the long shadows where visibility was limited. Rocks jutted from the ground like teeth, threatening to unseat their horses with every misstep. Each moment, each turn, tested them, the desert's harshness magnified by the imminent threat. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Maribel glanced at Rafe. "We can't keep running forever," she said quietly. "There's a man I need to confront. He's the one responsible for my husband's death." Rafe's eyes narrowed. "We'll face him," he said firmly. "But not recklessly. We need a plan, or this will end badly, for both of us." The sound of the posse drew closer, boots clattering against rock, horses snorting, the echo bouncing unnaturally between canyon walls. Rafe's jaw tightened. He had faced life and death moments before, but this was different. This wasn't a simple robbery or a barroom fight. This was a moral reckoning, one where his choices could cost more than money or freedom, they could cost a life. Maribel's hand trembled slightly, but her eyes were fierce. "I can't let him get away again," she whispered. "I won't." Rafe glanced at her, admiration mixed with concern. She was more than a bride in peril, she was a force of nature, unbowed by fear, driven by justice and grief. And yet he knew the stakes. One wrong move, and the desert would claim them both. The shadows deepened, and Rafe made a decision. He slowed his horse, guiding Maribel into a narrow alcove, hidden from view. "We fight smart," he said, voice low but steady. "We make them come to us, and we use the land to our advantage. No heroics, no rushing. We survive, and we win." Maribel nodded, the tension in her body easing slightly. Together, they crouched in the shadowed rocks, listening as the posse drew closer. Every footstep, every snort of a horse, amplified the pounding of their hearts. The canyon had become a crucible, testing courage, trust, and determination. And now, the moment of reckoning was almost upon them. Rafe's hand hovered near his revolver, eyes scanning the path ahead. He had spent years running from danger, avoiding consequences, and living only for himself. But now, with Maribel at his side, he understood that courage was more than survival. It was about standing firm, even when the odds were stacked against you. The desert held its breath. The posse was near. And in the growing darkness, Rafe and Maribel prepared for the confrontation that would decide not only justice, but the measure of their own hearts. The desert night was still, the sky above a blanket of stars that seemed indifferent to the struggles below. In the narrow canyon, Rafe Calder and Maribel Kane waited, crouched behind jagged rocks, their breaths shallow and hearts pounding. Somewhere beyond the shadows, the posse moved, unaware that the hunters had just become the hunted. Rafe's hand rested on his revolver, every muscle coiled, his mind sharp. Years of running, hiding, and surviving had prepared him for moments like this, yet nothing had prepared him for the weight of choice he now carried. This was not just survival, it was justice, morality, and, in a quiet way, redemption. Maribel's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "We do this together," she whispered. Rafe nodded. "Together," he echoed, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of responsibility as something more than a burden. It was a purpose that gave him direction, courage, and even a strange sense of hope. The posse entered the canyon cautiously, unaware of the trap awaiting them. Rafe's eyes flicked to Maribel. She had grown stronger, more capable, than he could have imagined. Her fear was gone, replaced with a fierce determination that mirrored his own. This was no longer just about vengeance, it was about preventing more harm, ensuring justice was done, and proving that courage could stand where brutality failed. A sudden shout broke the quiet, and the posse realized too late that they were walking into an ambush. Rafe moved with precision, firing a warning shot that sent horses skidding and men ducking. Maribel followed suit, guiding her horse to block the narrow path and using every ounce of courage she had cultivated over the long, grueling journey. The confrontation was swift, tense, and unforgiving. Rafe and Maribel worked in silent coordination, forcing the posse back with strategy and daring. Every action was measured, every moment carried the weight of life and death. It was a test of skill, endurance, and willpower, a final proving ground for two people who had been forged by the desert's trials. Finally, the man responsible for Maribel's husband's death appeared, stepping from the shadows, confidence in his eyes and cruelty in his smile. But the desert had changed the rules, and he was unprepared for the combined determination of the outlaw and the deserted bride. Rafe's hand did not waver, Maribel's resolve did not falter, and together they cornered him, leaving no escape. The man fell to his knees, realizing that his betrayal, his cruelty, and his disregard for life had finally met a force greater than his cunning. Maribel stepped forward, her eyes blazing, and whispered words that were not just for him, but for the memory of her husband and the countless innocents he had threatened. Justice, at last, was theirs. With the threat neutralized, the canyon grew quiet again. Rafe lowered his revolver, feeling the tension drain from his body. He looked at Maribel, gratitude and admiration reflected in his gaze. "You were incredible," he said, voice rough but sincere. Maribel smiled faintly, brushing ash and dust from her hair. "We did it together," she reminded him, echoing their earlier words, and the weight of the journey they had shared settled between them like a gentle bond. The desert, once a place of relentless trial, now seemed different, almost alive, almost forgiving. The sun began to rise, painting the sands in warm shades of gold and pink. Rafe felt a quiet change within himself, a shift from the man who ran from danger to the one who stood for something greater. Freedom remained, yes, but it was now accompanied by the knowledge that courage, loyalty, and justice were worth fighting for. Maribel clutched her letters one last time, then let them go, letting the wind carry the ashes across the dunes. A chapter of grief had closed, replaced by the faint but undeniable promise of hope. Rafe and Maribel rode side by side into the rising sun, the desert stretching endlessly before them. There would be challenges ahead, always, but they faced them together now, not as outlaw and bride, not as hunter and hunted, but as partners, as allies, perhaps even as something more. And somewhere in the vast, quiet desert, the wind whispered approval, carrying with it the sense that redemption, love, and justice could coexist, even in the harshest of lands. Thanks for watching.